The air in the hospital's emergency bay shivered where the fans cut it into slow ribbons. Awa lay on a narrow bed, palms open, as if releasing something no one else could carry. The oxygen gauge whispered empty. The nurse pulled the strap on the mask and looked at the doorway the way sailors look at the horizon. Outside, a motorbike braked hard and a courier slid off with a form, a stamp, another delay-riding pillion. In the distance, just beyond the ring road, past the shuttered shops where chalk listed prices like prayers, the dry port gates rose in flaking green. The words Gate 3, bonded, stenciled twice, once in the old paint, once in the new. Behind those gates, a pallet of oxygen cylinders had been cooling in their own silence for 3 days, detained by a ledger thicker than sense. Nurse Miriam wiped her hands on a cloth and spoke softly to Awa, telling her, "Breathe in, breathe out," even as breathing had become a negotiation. She was the courageous insider the city never knew it had. Quick with a syringe, stubborn with a registrar. She had argued with the procurement officer at dawn and with the customs clerk at noon, and with the guard at Gate 3 as dusk reddened the corrugated roofs. Each time she presented the same file, a letter from the ministry listing the cylinders as essential, a duty waiver signed last year, and a stamped receipt. Each time the guard's finger found a different line in a bound ledger. A surcharge that had slept like a cobra in a clause. A missing countersignature from an understudy no one had seen since the rains. A half-day fee for storage because the inspection officer had gone for prayers and then never returned to his desk. The gate was a door and also a sentence. The ledger turned a need into a theory. At the center of that gate sat an obstructive official whose white shirt had learned how not to wrinkle. Chief Controller Doumbia, a man who carried his authority in a badge and in the gravity of his pauses. He was not villainous, only diligent in an order designed to stall. He believed in forms. He believed the nation's backbone was a column of numbers. He told Miriam, with a patience that felt like refusal, that the cylinders would move when the ledger moved, and the ledger moved when the right ink had dried. Behind him, the pallet steamed in the afternoon glare. In front of him, the city wheezed. The talk in the city was that Ibrahim had arrived quietly. No sirens, no convoy chewing lanes from the roundabout to the palace. He walked into offices like wind walks into blinds. He had a way of reading a room's silence before he spoke, a habit of touching a doorframe as if to remind it that it was only wood. To some, he was the leader. To others, he was just a man with an insistence that care could be reordered. He asked for a copy of the ledger. He asked for the gate keys. He asked for the time between arrival and release, and the time between breath and bill. A truth-telling aide named Kofi kept these questions in a notebook, the color of the rainy season, and did not let the answers escape into slogans. The wound was visible early and everywhere. Children with plastic bottles cut into masks. Elders with lungs that had learned to ration. The sound of coughing on the 6 a.m. bus. A system hovered above the city like a cloud that would not rain. Funding came, funding went, and oxygen sat just out of reach because a page said pending. Western donors posted pastel infographics about aid flows and transparency. Ministers traded speeches in air-conditioned halls about partnership. But at Gate 3, a woman waited behind a chipped turnstile for a stamp that would not land. That week, a summit arranged in the capital's new glass building gathered Western dignitaries who arrived with lapel flags and teams of briefers. They brought words like safeguards, conditionalities, cost recovery. Ibrahim brought a battered briefcase and a handful of care workers' testimonies, written in blue ink on the back of requisition forms. The cameras caught the shine of cufflinks and the dull steel of the lock on Gate 3. On the city's telegram channels, a photo of Awa's bed went round with a caption, "Oxygen stuck, gate stuck, breath stuck." By the third evening, as the muezzin's call thinned and the motorbikes thickened, Awa's breathing turned shallow. She apologized to Miriam for being a burden. Miriam, who had learned to count heartbeats when the clocks failed, bent close and said, "No one is a burden." She said, "Help is a door." She said, "I will find the key." Outside, the sky burned down into a darker blue. Beyond the hospital fence, a boy in a football jersey ran past with a plastic bag of bread, and a radio on a kiosk played a host named Salif, unpacking a story about air that cannot be sold. The section closed as the nurse stepped into the corridor, squared her shoulders toward Gate 3, and chose a fight with paper. At dawn, the city wakes in the rasp of brooms on concrete and the hot hiss of kettles. A row of dashboards flickered to life in ministries, where the security guard still naps with a newspaper, tented over his eyes. On one screen, a spreadsheet showed inbound shipments by commodity and tariff code. On another, a pie chart spread like a bruise. Kofi watched the numbers and saw a story the charts refused to tell. The longest lines were for the simplest things: oxygen, insulin, blood bags. because the rules had learned to multiply. He walked the narrow stairs to Ibrahim's office, the plaster mottled and the ceiling fan stitched with dust, and laid out a single page, a timeline. Arrival at the port, 3 days ago. Entry at gate 3, stamped. Invoice stamped, paid. Duty waiver, ignored. Inspection, deferred. Release? No, Ibrahim read the page without sitting, eyes briefly closed as if to listen for a breath on the other side of town. The escalation, when it came, was precise. He did not pound the table. He called the minister responsible for customs and instructed him to meet at gate 3 in an hour. He asked Kofi to bring the ledger, the warehouse key register, and a portable camera. He asked Miriam to stand with him at the gate at noon. He would reorder the sequence of care in a place that worshipped sequence. Western delegates, already fitted with earpieces for simultaneous translation in the summit hall, received an unexpected notification. The keynote would move outdoors. Chief Controller Doumbia watched Ibrahim's approach through the warped glass of his office and felt the building hold its breath. He was a man who believed replacing one stamp with another never saved a life, but he also knew men who changed one rule and called it reform. When Ibrahim arrived with a nurse, a briefcase, and a truth-telling aide, not a bevy of bodyguards, Doumbia sensed a different grammar. Ibrahim greeted the clerks by name, thumbed the corner of the ledger the way one feels a lock's give, and asked for the log of denials. There was no log. There was only the ledger and its wilderness of columns. He asked for the key cabinet. The rings hung heavy as a promise on the pegboard. The principal gate key was tagged G3 primary in fading marker. Though this morning, someone had placed it on a different hook. A crowd gathered in the heat, some from the hospital, some from the radio station, most from the surrounding stalls where spare parts and talismans and imported biscuits hung from strings. Salif, the radio host, arrived with a microphone that had survived elections and blackouts alike. He spoke with the measured cadence of a man who knows that on the air, the breath between words is also content. He asked Ibrahim why a summit had moved to a dusty gate. Ibrahim said, because breath doesn't wait for plenary. He said, because a door that stands in the way of care is not a door. He said, because systems are written by people and can be rewritten by people. Western ambassadors, their shoes white with the dust that equalizes, formed a polite semicircle. One of them spoke of governance, another of sustainability, a third of leakages and fiduciary risk. They had come bearing advice. They encountered a case. Ibrahim listened, then touched the ledger. He read, line by line, the fees a shipment had collected like barnacles. He stopped at the line item, escrow hold pending donor assurance. He looked up. He said, this is a sentence that chokes. He spoke the words again, and Salif's microphone made them a public object. Escrow, hold, assurance. He asked who had put that clause there. No one owned it. It had arrived in a template, attached to a grant, then to a memo, then to a routine, until men like Doumbia held it like doctrine to survive their own audits. The gate was not only iron, it was international. Miriam stepped forward, hands trembling not with fear but with fatigue and fury, and spoke of Awa. She said, there are 4 beds using 1 cylinder. She said, I have been trained to nurse lungs, not ledgers. She named the room where the fans cut the air and where faces count minutes. A hush moved through the semicircle of shoes. In the hush, a mid-level Western official, no tie, sleeves rolled, shifted. He was not a villain either. He was accountable to a different dashboard, one that measured transactions secured, not breaths saved. He saw in Miriam's face the miscount. Ibrahim's intervention, still only intention, became action. He said, today here we reorder. He requested the warehouse seal be broken under camera and 2 witnesses, and that the oxygen be escorted to the hospital by the guard himself. He said the invoice for duty would be held against an emergency fund, not against a patient's pulse. He named it, not with a flourish, but with a description anyone could remember. Breath before billing. He said, if we err, let us err toward air. Doumbia, staring at the key, understood that disobedience would mean disgrace. Obedience could mean censure in some future audit written by someone who had never heard this crowd breathe. He looked at the Western delegates, then at the town. He took the G3 primary key off its new hook, the metal cold, and placed it in Ibrahim's open hand. Beyond the gate, cylinders winked in dull chrome like mirrors of a future that could be ordinary. The padlock opened. The bolts slid. The breath of the crowd changed. The first pallet jolted onto a forklift, manned by a worker who checked over his shoulder for a reprimand that did not come. The cylinders moved, and with them, something else. The city's sense of what a gate was for. The day's heat lifted a degree. Awa, not knowing why, felt a brush of wind on her cheek she would later describe as a door opening far away. They said later that it looked like a procession, even though it was just logistics done honestly. A forklift, a pickup, 2 motorbikes, a guard in a clean uniform riding in the back with his badge turned outward. The oxygen cylinders strapped with rope, settling into one another with the soft clatter of responsibility. Salif's radio van rattled ahead, broadcasting the route like a play-by-play, leaving Gate 3, crossing the roundabout, past the mango sellers, onto the boulevard where schoolchildren held their noses against the diesel. The Western delegates remained at the gate, some checking their phones, some watching the forklift like a strange animal, some whispering about precedents. Ibrahim walked with the convoy until the hospital gate, then stood aside while Miriam and her colleagues received the cylinders, their gloved hands quick and precise as a liturgy. Inside, the first hiss of oxygen into a regulator sounded like a secret finally spoken aloud. Alwa's eyes flickered. She took a slower breath. She did not know who to thank. The ward, so long practiced in rationing, adjusted as if a new clock had been set. Tanks rolled. Straps tightened. A porter named Adil, who loved snooker and hated fuss, moved one cylinder into the corner because he had learned that gifts are only real when they are stored as tools, not displayed as trophies. On a whiteboard, someone wrote the hour of arrival, then underlined it, then circled it, then put an asterisk, because this hour would become a reference. Intervention is more than a door opening. It is the door staying open. Ibrahim knew a single gesture could be devoured by the ledger, unless proof made it stubborn. He asked Kofi to install, within that same hour, a simple metric board in the hospital entryway, the kind with plastic letters one presses into slots. Kofi wrote 3 lines that anyone could read on their way to visit someone they loved. Gate to help minutes, denials in last 24, complaints resolved. In black letters, as plain as bread, the board declared that numbers would no longer live only in the ministry. They would live where the need lived. He printed a WhatsApp number on cheap paper with a glue stick and posted it beneath the board. Report a delay. Anonymous is fine. We must know to know. The nurse at the triage desk nodded. She knew who would use it. She had their numbers already. Back at Gate 3, Chief Controller Dumbias sat at his desk with the ledger open to the page where the oxygen entries had become scratches of movement rather than a sentence of rest. He felt relief and apprehension coil around each other like strands in a rope. The intervention had been public, which meant it would be audited by 100 mouths. The Western delegates were already asking when and how the emergency fund would be replenished. What guardrails would exist? Who would be liable if breath before billing became a whisper on lips seeking advantage? He answered them as well as he could, with honesty about the present state and a willingness to sign his name under the new process. He would need a counterweight to fear. He would need a rule with enough spine for him to lean on. That evening, Ibrahim convened a meeting in the hospital courtyard under a tree that kept half the sun off the benches. He invited not only ministers but orderlies, intake clerks, the guard who had carried the cylinders, Salif with his microphone, and 2 women from the market who had lost a cousin the week before. He asked them to describe the true sequence of care as they lived it. They spoke of how the gate dictated the hospital's pulse, how brokers hovered, how receipts multiplied, how a denial at 10 a.m. meant a funeral at dusk. He spoke less than all of them. He wrote more. When the Western official with sleeves rolled asked to speak, he did so without the diction of a panel. He admitted that an escrow clause had traveled too far without reconsideration. He said his agency would examine how assurances could be decoupled from breath. He did not call it reform. He called it correction. By night, the WhatsApp number had already lit. Messages came in clusters punctuated by selfies of lines, snapshots of doors, screenshots of transfer requests. Kofi, who understood that systems were a conversation, created a simple template reply that asked for times, names, and a photo if possible. He promised, not in grand terms but in a sentence that tasted of duty, that each complaint would receive a first response within 4 hours and a resolution or clear plan within 72. Salif read the number on the air between songs and stories about the day. He called it a small gate anyone could carry in their pocket. Awa slept. Miriam sat on the steps and finally allowed her shoulders to drop. Intervention had released pressure. It had also invited scrutiny. She could already picture the next cylinder stuck for a different reason with a different signature and a different man hugging his ledger. She realized how much of her life had been about asking permission and how strange it felt to be invited to write a rule. She thought of the line on the board, gate to help minutes. She counted them in her head the way one counts a heartbeat, and she decided that if she would be measured, she would also be heard. She would speak to the investigation that had to come. The audit began with the quiet sound of a camera clicking over pages. Kofi and a small team, 2 civil servants from the inspectorate, 1 data clerk from the port, and a teacher who had learned to read budgets like novels, sat in a room with a stuck window and 3 ledgers. They wore no capes. They wore office shirts with frayed collars. Their superpower, if one can use that word in a city allergic to theatrics, was stubborn attention. The team mapped the path of essential goods, how a donor's funds traveled through a bank like a river through a desert, how letters of comfort became letters of command when they hit the templates at home offices abroad, how a fee that had begun as a caution had become a ritual. They discovered the brokers, men with baseball caps and phones who called themselves facilitators, who had learned the ledger's weaknesses and sold time in the gaps. Kofi created a wall of string and pins, not to mimic detective dramas, but because retiring the myth of a faceless system required faces and dates. There was a clause labeled assurance hold. There was a line item labeled storage day 3+. There was a handwritten addendum requiring supervisory espousal, a phrase no one could define, but everyone had obeyed. There was the practice of percentage-based seizure fees that paid the gatekeepers a cut of what they detained. The perverse incentive was not a theory, it was a keyboard shortcut. The investigation found screenshots on Telegram, where a broker told a hospital clerk to stop making noise because the file moves when we move. It found voice notes that felt like weather reports for people waiting to breathe. Chief Controller Dombia, invited into the room not as a defendant but as a witness of process, watched his profession's bones laid out without cruelty. He spoke of the fear of auditors who arrived at month's end asking only for receipts. He described the arithmetic of self-protection. If you release on compassion, you expose yourself on compliance. If you release on compliance, you expose the patient to death. He admitted that the percentage-based fee had made officers into reluctant merchants. He said aloud, in a voice that resembled apology, that he had stayed behind the ledger because the ledger is a door you can close and say you were only doing your job. Salif's radio show became a public forum without venom. He read excerpts from the clauses, interleaving them with messages from the WhatsApp line. A mother described watching a box of pediatric antibiotics ripen in a shaded warehouse while her boy's fever peeled his lips. A pharmacist recounted the conversation in which a guard had used the phrase "no problem" to mean the opposite. A mid-level Western official called in, anonymously at first, to say the word assurance had become a mask that hid decisions no one wanted to own. The show did not name villains. It named mechanisms. The exposure required proof the city could hold in its hand. Kofi built a public dashboard with lines any schoolchild could explain. The average gate-to-help minutes for essential goods, reported by both warehouse logbooks and hospital arrivals, the number of denials in the last 24 hours, with reasons and initials, the percentage of complaints resolved within the 72-hour window. The board appeared on an LCD at the hospital entrance, a printout at the gate, and a web page that loaded even on slow data. Beside it, a thin ledger lay open for anyone's note, a book citizens could sign not to petition but to contribute. In its first week, the line of gate to help dipped, rose, then dipped again as the effect of attention settled into habit. The graph became a story that did not need a narrator. Then came the difficult part, the naming with consequences. The investigation sent letters to 3 brokers requiring them to register or be barred. It recommended that percentage-based seizure fees be abolished and replaced with fixed salaries and transparent performance incentives unrelated to detentions. It proposed that the assurance hold clause be struck from all agreements touching essential goods, and that assurance, if needed, be achieved post-release via randomized audits funded by donors, not delayed breath funded by patients. It cited paragraphs, not feelings, and listed page numbers where time had been trapped. Western leaders who had stood at Gate 3 now received a dossier written in plain English and clearer French, stapled, paginated, footnoted. It did not paint them as saboteurs. It showed them where their policies had made customs officials into gamblers. One ambassador read it on the ride to the airport and began to reword his speech for the next city, the next summit where applause felt like rain, but often fed only flowers made of paper. He underlined the phrase, "reorder the sequence of care," because it did not blame. It instructed, Ibrahim signed the cover page as one signs a receipt and a promise. He sent it to the Attorney General with a note. No scapegoats, only standards. He sent it to the donor agencies with a request. Adjust your templates or say why you cannot. He taped a copy to the staff bulletin board. He did not call a press conference. He called for reform. Reform, like breath, must be simple to be sustained. The announcement did not come in a hall with chandeliers, but in the hospital courtyard, under the same tree that made the same uneven shade. Ibrahim stepped forward with Mariam on one side and Dumbia on the other, and read the new rule in a voice that could cross a street without a microphone. "A breath before billing is now policy," he said. "All shipments of defined essential goods, oxygen, insulin, blood bags, pediatric antibiotics, will be released within 1 hour of arrival with a provisional receipt. Duty reconciliation will occur within 7 days against the Central Emergency Fund. No patient, no ward, no nurse will ever again negotiate with a ledger for air." He paused as the word settled, then continued. "We will measure openly. Gate to help minutes. Denials in last 24 hours with reasons and initials. Complaints resolved within 72 hours. The board will be public. The numbers will be boring or something is wrong. The teeth of the reform were not hidden. They were elegant in their plainness. The percentage-based seizure fee that had fed the perverse incentive was abolished. In its place, customs officers received a fixed salary with an additional stipend tied to accurate, timely release of essential goods, verified by hospital arrival logs rather than internal claims. Brokers were required to register, their fees capped and posted. Unregistered facilitation was now just a word renamed extortion. And where evidence met standard, it would face prosecution with the same dull regularity as a payslip. The assurance hold clause was struck from all essential goods agreements by joint communique with donor agencies that agreed assurance should be secured after care. Not before. Kofi described the enforcement mechanism with the clarity of a classroom chalkboard. Any denial or delay beyond 60 minutes required a written justification posted to the dashboard within 4. A denial without a posted reason was by definition a breach. The complaint channel kept its WhatsApp number and added an SMS short code for those without data. Responses within 4 hours were non-negotiable, with a weekly report published in 2 places where paper was still king, at the gate and on the hospital wall. Anonymous reports were accepted, but they now asked for one more detail, a photo of the door. Gates had faces. They would have names. Training came next, and it was intentionally embarrassingly simple. A drill repeated each morning for 2 weeks, a volunteer acting as a cylinder, a guard acting as the gate, a clerk acting as the ledger, a nurse acting as timekeeper. The cue, a phone alarm labeled arrival. The rule, release within 1 minute in the drill so that an hour in reality would feel generous. They practiced carrying the cylinder, recording the time, stamping the provisional release, logging the hospital arrival. They laughed at first. Then they stopped laughing because they recognized themselves in the drill, how they had always known the muscle memory of the wrong sequence and how the right sequence needed rehearsal. A poster went up with 5 steps numbered like a child's diagram. No acronyms, no foreign words. Donor agencies signed their piece as well, in language their auditors could respect. They agreed to fund the Central Emergency Fund with a predictable line item, to accept post-release randomized audits with recovery in cases of fraud, to assign a phone number that answered within the same 90 seconds as the ambulance dispatch. Western leaders, faced with a reform that did not ask their permission to be moral, endorsed it anyway, and some privately admitted they felt relief being told the consequences of their templates. The sleeves-rolled official returned to his office and sent an email with the subject, Clause Removal, Essential Goods. It was a small thing in a big building. It was also a door opening in a world of doors. Prosecutions were rare and therefore meaningful. Where brokers had played the ledger like a xylophone, they were invited to register, to move their skill into sunlight or to leave the gate. A handful chose the latter and found other ways to be busy. A few did not, and courtrooms that usually loved drama settled instead for fact, dates, times, sums, signatures. The judge called the new policy by its name and asked the defense if they understood the rule. They did. They were punished proportionally, and the city forgot their names with the same speed it remembers football scores. Within a month, the Gate to Help line on the dashboard found its level. It hovered around 42 minutes, then 39, then 34. Complaints dipped. The board did not glow, it sat. Mariam kept a notebook of times like a gardener tracks rain. Dumbia, whose shirt still resisted wrinkles out of habit, grew accustomed to signing provisional releases, like someone says grace before eating, not to impress, but to mark the moment as a right order. Salif stopped leading every show with oxygen and returned to his usual roster of birthdays, bus schedules, and small corruptions at the licensing office. The reform became a system, then a habit, then a culture that apologized for itself less and delivered more. On a plain morning unfit for legend, a boy tugged his mother's hand past the hospital board and asked what the numbers were. She told him, in the simple poetry of citizens who have been forced to learn administration, that they were promises measured. Gate to Help minutes 31. Denials in last 24H, 0. Complaints resolved, 12. He nodded as if they were facts about the weather. He would grow up thinking it normal that breath is not delayed by bills, that doors serve people, that ledgers are tools, not bosses. The city had acquired the boredom of good systems, which is a rare luxury. Awa walked back to the hospital weeks after her crisis, with a bowl of rice and sweetened tea for the nurses. She laughed in a way that had space in it. She stood for a moment by the gate and watched a cylinder roll past, unremarkable. Miriam hugged her with the ease of colleagues who have survived a storm together and now discuss harvests. She no longer spent her afternoons at Gate 3. She spent them with patience and with a new cohort of interns learning that righteous urgency can be organized. Her voice on the WhatsApp complaint line changed too. It was still firm. It was less edged by fatigue. She replied with timestamps and gratitude. Chief Controller Doumbia kept his job and found that he could sleep. His desk's top drawer, once a nest of sticky notes with favors scribbled in urgent shorthand, now held clean forms and one small photograph of the day the padlock opened, tucked where only he could see. He became the man junior officers approached, not for shortcuts but for clarity. He had traded a shadow economy of fear for the bright boredom of standards, and discovered, to his own surprise, that dignity lived there. Once, at a conference, a peer asked if it felt like a loss to surrender discretion. He answered quietly that discretion had been a burden masquerading as power. Kofi moved the dashboard's maintenance into a routine. Every Friday at noon, he printed the week's graph and posted it under a clip, then walked to the market for fried plantains and a bottle of water. He conducted what he called a culture check by asking 3 people who did not look like auditors what the board meant. If they shrugged, he smiled. If they quarreled with a number, he wrote it down. If they had forgotten the hotline, he pointed. He did not attend many summits. He attended the gate. He tested the complaint SLA by sending a message himself once a month from a new number, just to feel the system's reflexes. Each time a reply arrived within the window, he let himself one deep breath of satisfaction and returned to his desk. Salif's show, now less consumed by oxygen, devoted a segment each week to a different gate. A school's enrollment office, where children once waited behind lines that only existed in the heads of clerks. A registry where certificates had been cages. A transit depot where a broker's handshake had been worth more than a timetable. In each place, the breath before billing ethos adapted its name and found a foothold. Learn before ledger in the schools, register before revenue in the registry, ride before receipt at the depot. The radio did not claim these as revolutions. It introduced them as chores done well. Callers began to compare gate-to-service minutes the way they once compared team statistics. Rivalries shifted into the harmless sort where pride is not cruel. Western leaders returned to their capitals. Some changed in small ways that matter. A clause disappeared from a template. A slide deck lost a bullet point that had seemed wise until it was tested against a hallway where a mother waits. The sleeves-rolled official kept on rolling his sleeves and, at year's end, sent a note to Ibrahim with a photograph of a revised contract, assurance hold, missing where it had once been. It did not make news. It made room. Ibrahim, whose name had carried thunder in the title of a story, walked more quietly as the months wore on. He visited the gate once, then less. He preferred the places where systems dunked their hand into daily life and came up wet. The ward at noon, when the light falls exactly across the floor. The back office, where a clerk explains the dashboard to a grandmother. The small training where a guard and a nurse rehearse their 1-minute drill and laugh at themselves and then do it faster. In speeches, when he had to give them, he avoided the drama of confrontation. He told the story of a door that remembered it was wood and a ledger that remembered it was paper. He named the ordinary workers. He said thank you more than he said I. The city did not become heaven. It did not even become tidy. But when the harm came, as harm does in some other form on some other day, there was muscle memory in place. People picked up rules like tools. A complaint line stirred as if waking from a nap and set to work. The board flickered and recovered after a blackout, and the numbers were there waiting in the low light. The boy who had asked about the metrics months ago ran past with a school bag bouncing, waved at the guard he now knew by name, and did not break stride. He had learned that doors open when pushed for the right reasons. In a late afternoon, where the heat softened like bread, Ibrahim stood again at the old gate 3 and laid his palm briefly on the green paint. He listened for the sound of the padlock, and finding none, he listened instead to the ordinary movements behind the metal. Footsteps, a radio faint in a distant office, the squeak of a seal signed, the sigh of a bolt undone, the hiss of a cylinder rolling out into a world that, for once, had remembered the right order of things. He let the moment pass, as all rightful victories should, into the fabric of the city's boredom. Then he turned and walked toward the hospital, where breaths were no longer counted by the ledger, but by the lives that carried them.